Hi, this is Morley Robbins, and I'm talking through the presentation that I just gave this past weekend at the Health Freedom Expo in Los Angeles on March 3rd of 2012, and it's entitled Misled and Misfed, What They Don't Want You to Know About Magnesium. I think Linus Pauling said it best when he said that you can trace every ailment, every sickness, and every disease to a mineral deficiency. You might note that either he was very lucky or very smart. The fact that he has two unshared Nobels leads me to believe that maybe it's more the latter. So who am I? Well, I'm a former hospital exec who's seen the light. I've become a health czar. And as you might expect, I have some very strong opinions about what it takes to get and stay healthy. I'm a late-in-life athlete. I've had the opportunity to complete several marathons, and I've also completed an Olympic distance triathlon. But I didn't start until I was 50 years old. So for those of you in the audience who are contemplating those life goals, get started early. It's a lot easier when you're much younger. I've also had the opportunity of parachuting from 3 miles up. I'll tell you, it's a great way to clear your cobwebs. And probably more than anything else, I delight in separating fact from fiction, particularly as it relates to history and nutrition. The real focus of my presentation here, though, is about the fact that I think the American public has been misled and misfed. What I intend to do is lay out several key pieces of information in an effort to prove that very point. The only thing that I would ask is, please don't shoot the messenger. A number of people ask me, well, what are the books that have influenced your thinking? So I thought I would share a handful of the ones that have really been very important in my distilling my thoughts and influencing the material that I'm about to share with you. The first was a book that my oldest son brought to my attention, Lies My Teacher Told Me. It's an outstanding book. I would encourage everyone to read it, but I think it's very unsettling when you find out the real history of our nation, particularly the fact that something as significant as that Woodrow Wilson, in addition to being a great president, was also a white supremacist. A wonderful book by Ellen Langer, who is a social psychologist at Harvard, is entitled Counterclockwise. And what you learn in that book is that, in fact, aging is a social phenomenon as much as it is a biological process. Gary Taubes, one of the great science writers of our time, wrote a phenomenal book entitled Good Calories, Bad Calories. And it turns out that our entire heart-healthy diet is completely backwards because we have been trained and educated to believe that, in fact, the butter in that picture is the bad calorie and that the toast is the good calorie, when, in fact, it's just the opposite. Many of you may not be familiar with Weston A. Price, but he was a famous dentist back at the turn of the century, and during the 1920s and 30s, he and his wife traveled the globe for 20 years looking for communities of people who had perfect teeth and therefore perfect health. Much to everyone's surprise, every one of those communities was non-vegetarian and had a phenomenal health record that is very well chronicled in his book called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. I would highly recommend it. And then finally, Mildred Seelig was probably the greatest proponent of magnesium on the world up until her death in 2005. And she lays out a very compelling argument about how magnesium deficiency is, in fact, the very origin of disease. I've had the opportunity of reading many books now on magnesium. I've also read close to 300 scientific articles, but these 5 books in particular did a lot to shape my thinking about what's happened to dietary policy in the United States. I want you to think of me as Toto. For those of you who have seen the movie The Wizard of Oz, you remember that very poignant scene when the little dog pulls back the green curtain only to reveal that the great and mighty Oz is in fact the snake oil salesman, and he says, "Pay no attention to the man behind the green curtain." Well, I want you to pay attention to the man behind the green curtain, because I'm pulling back the curtain on the healthcare industry. My goal during the course of this presentation is to have you begging for magnesium by the end of this presentation. All right, well, let's get started. We all know that the Earth is not flat, although this was what guided people's thinking for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But what we come to realize is that that was just the social construction of reality. In fact, we know that the Earth is a blue marble. It is an amazing sphere of life, and we are very blessed to be a part of it. But we didn't come upon that truth easily. It turns out that Pythagoras actually theorized and proved back in 522 that in fact the Earth was indeed round, and the intelligentsia were very quick to buy into that concept, but in fact it took the common man, the average person, thousands of years to come to that realization. And it wasn't until Magellan's ship came back a year after his death, actually, so it was 2,000 years later, that the common man actually became to accept the fact that in fact the world was round. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we don't have 2,000 years to come to realize that what I'm about to talk about is in fact true. I don't think we have 2,000 days, which is about 5.5 years. So let's get a little farther into the story. What I'm about to share with you is akin to me telling you that Santa is just an idea, that your parents are fallible, and that police, politicians, and priests don't always have your best interests at heart. There was a time, in fact, when doctors recommended Camels over any other cigarette. This ad is, in fact, from 1948. It gives you a real powerful glimpse about the impact of the social construction of reality. And what you'll find out is that your doctor isn't always right. That's an important premise for this presentation. And you see, this concept has been around for a long, long time, that people would rather believe a simple lie than the complex truth. And Lao Tzu was the first to be recorded as having observed that phenomenon in society. Well, here is an example of the myths, or the simple lies, if you will, that are running medicine and nutrition in the United States. The cholesterol myth. Do flies cause garbage? No. In fact, it's just the opposite. So that myth has been very successfully challenged, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. The saturated fat myth. If the low-fat diet was in fact a way to get healthy, then why is 2/3 of America overweight and half of those people obese? The salt myth. It turns out that we are using exactly 1/3 of the salt that our ancestors used prior to refrigeration. Actually, we're using the wrong kind of salt, and we'll explore that a little bit more as well. The calcium myth. When we were growing up, we were all familiar with teachers using calcium carbonate on the blackboard. We knew it as chalk, and in fact, many of you out there are probably using that very same chemical, calcium carbonate, in the calcium supplements that you're using every day. The vitamin D myth. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. The sugar myth. In George Washington's day, the average American, or the average colonial, I should say, was using 3 pounds of sugar per year. And here we are in 2010 using 220 pounds per person per year. Now, I don't eat a lot of sugar, so there's someone out there who's having over 400 pounds of sugar a year. But the point is, we've increased the sugar consumption in this country by 73-fold. The mercury myth. What they've discovered is that mercury is a very dangerous and toxic heavy metal. despite what the American Dental Association would have you believe, and despite what the vaccine program would have you believe. But they've known that for many, many years. And it turns out that the original research on the safety of mercury as a dental amalgam was done on cadavers. So it's actually okay to use mercury as long as you don't drink hot liquids or don't chew. And finally, the fluoride myth. It turns out that the original article that was written in 1948 espousing the safety and the importance of fluoride was in fact written about men who were working at the factory where hydrofluoric acid was used to enrich uranium. And the article actually states that men who were exposed to fluoride had no cavities. 50 years later, through the use of the Freedom of Information Act, the actual data was acquired, and it turns out that what the writer actually said before it was edited was men exposed to fluoride had no teeth. All right, so what's important to understand here is that, in fact, the cholesterol, saturated fat, salt, and calcium myths have all been soundly disproven. And, in fact, the sugar myth, the mercury myth, and the fluoride myth, the authorities are very silent about. They don't want you to know about that. So I guess the question that I have for the audience is, why do we think that if they've been wrong on 7 of these 8 myths, why are we suddenly consuming so much vitamin D? In fact, it turns out that vitamin D is the oldest hormone on this planet. And it's important to understand how hormones work. They communicate with their target cells. And in this case, what the hormone D is suggesting to its target cell, the intestines, we need more calcium, absorb more calcium, and put it into the bloodstream. And what the body is telling us is we have too much calcium, and that's why this blood test is showing that these levels are low. The blood level is in fact looking at what's called storage vitamin D. And in fact, it takes magnesium to convert storage vitamin D into active vitamin D. We have completely misread and misunderstood this vitamin, and I would encourage anyone who's taking thousands of units a day to really rethink this and to make sure that they understand how these chemicals communicate and what the downstream impact is of all of this storage vitamin D that's being introduced into our body. And it's a foregone conclusion that the vast majority of Americans are in fact magnesium deficient. Well, how in the world are we going to flip this storage excess into active? It's a mystery to me, and I would really encourage people to be very careful about their ingesting this chemical. All right, let's move on. This is my basis for why, in fact, we have been misled and we are being misfed. Well, we all know that calcium is good for strong bones. But did you know that calcium is also good for strong bottom lines? Well, let me explain. It turns out that excess calcium is good for disease. Calcium is in fact drawn to an acidic environment, which most Americans tend to have. Calcium activates the sympathetic nervous system. We all know it as the fight or flight response, but it is the unregulated calcium that's causing the inflammation that's running our bodies. And inflammation is in fact the basis of all chronic disease. That's very well established in the research. But what you may not know is that magnesium in fact regulates calcium. There are 3 hormones that regulate the calcium levels in our body. There's parathyroid hormone, there's calcitonin, and yes, there's vitamin D. Well, it turns out that all 3 of those hormones are magnesium dependent, period. So it turns out that the more calcium you have in your body and the less magnesium, the better it is for biz, at least for the healthcare biz. But you don't have to believe me. Here's the research. I'm very happy for you to have the time to go through this and read for yourself what some of these leading researchers have to say about the impact of excess calcium and what it does metabolically to our body and to the whole calcification process. One of my favorite articles that I've come across is this article that appeared just a few years ago, and it was in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition. And what they point out is what they call the potentially beneficial roles for calcium. It's a rather loaded word, potentially. But then they go on to lay out 11 different diseases that are, quote unquote, potentially improved by the ingestion of calcium. Well, what I can assure you is that the research is showing just the opposite. That, in fact, breast cancer, colon cancer, and prostate cancer are now all recognized as being the byproduct of excess calcium to magnesium. The literature is so rich with indications that hypertension is in fact caused by excess calcium, particularly as it relates to the hardening of the arteries, and so on and so forth. But again, you don't have to believe me. Here's the citation. But what it's important for you to know is that there are in fact 222 references in this article. And I took the time to copy the entire article and then search for the word magnesium. You might be surprised to find out that it doesn't appear once in the article. What you may not be surprised to find out is that in fact this article was funded by the Dairy Council, as well as the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the NIH. Well, we just can't seem to get enough. A rather graphic portrayal, but I think it gets the point across that in fact we are just over-consuming the calcium in this country. And I'm going to introduce an important concept called the Cal-Mag ratio. The calcium to magnesium ratio is very, very important in the disease process, and there are many leading researchers who have very well documented it. Andrea Rosenoff, Heikki Karppinen, Larry Resnick, amongst many. But this is a very important concept, and it turns out that our body is really designed to have a ratio of 1 to 1. And that's why carrots are such a vital part of our diet, because they have the right balance of calcium to magnesium. Well, it turns out as you get into it, when you begin to understand this ratio, you find out that there are certain food groups that really do violate this, particularly as it relates to this ratio. Now, dairy has a ratio of 7 parts calcium to 1 part magnesium. Yogurt is a little bit more refined. It's 11 parts calcium. Cheese, 26 parts calcium. Fortified OJ, 27 parts calcium to 1 part magnesium. And for those of you who are suffering from acid indigestion, or I would actually say it's alkaline indigestion, it turns out you're getting 300 parts calcium to 1 part magnesium. That's a rather significant amount of calcium to be introduced. What I should also point out is that this is based on pasteurized milk. I think the information would be a little bit different for real milk, but we're not going to get into that argument at this point. But it's important to understand that in a healthy cell, there needs to be a significant amount of magnesium, that when the calcium levels begin to rise, the cell becomes unhealthy. It's not able to generate the right kind of energy. The whole function of the cell begins to deteriorate, and the cell membrane becomes much more permeable to invasion. And that's where a lot of us run into problems with our health. Again, you don't have to believe me. There's some very compelling research out there that explains the importance of this dynamic, and I would encourage you to seek these out. And as I mentioned, Heikki Karppinen was a Finnish researcher back in the 70s, and he set out to look at the coronary heart disease, which is the CHD, and was very clear and was able to demonstrate that this disease process is in fact fueled by an excessive Cal-Mag ratio. He studied his country because it was in fact the epicenter for coronary heart disease, and in fact the little star over there on the right side of the country is North Karelia, which is a little community where they suffer mightily from coronary heart disease. And what he was able to establish was that, in fact, there is this very close relationship between calcium and magnesium and heart disease, something that we'll come back to in a minute. And then here's a very important study done by Andrew Rozanov looking at the actual intake through our food of calcium and magnesium. And what you get a sense here is just this growing consumption of calcium compared to the magnesium intake. And what's particularly striking about this study is that she's not accounting for the calcium supplements that so many people are taking. There has been this extraordinary increase in calcium consumption for both men and women, and it's just continuing to become a factor in our day-to-day lives, and I would strongly encourage you to be very careful about the proper balance of your intake. And so we have this concept of the calcium lie, and there's a physician in Anchorage, Alaska, and his name is Robert Thompson. And I think he's done an outstanding job in this book entitled The Calcium Lie. And what you have here is the actual cascade, as he calls it, of when you have excess calcium in the body, what it leads to. And it's a very humbling and profound list of imbalances that begin to result from this excess of unregulated calcium. And the only reason why it's unregulated is that there just isn't sufficient magnesium in our diet nor in our body in order to maintain a proper balance. And you can begin to get a sense of what this cascade is all about as you begin to study it. Well, Dr. Thompson was heavily influenced by one of the leading researchers in this field, Dr. Guy Abraham, who practices in the Los Angeles area, and he wrote wrote many articles, but one in particular that's important is the calcium controversy from 1982. And in that article, he points out where the original breakthrough was in what was causing osteoporosis, not only in this country but in other parts of the world. And this was something that Dr. Daalderup from the Netherlands was able to identify, and he was the first to suggest that osteoporosis was in fact a magnesium deficient state as early as 1960. Again, we have been misled and we have been misfed. And what has this excess calcium led to? It has led to a doubling of the diabetes rate during the last 25 years. This has resulted in a tripling of the the obesity rate has doubled, the diabetes rate has tripled, the hospitalization rate has increased fourfold. And despite what you may think has been happening to coronary heart disease, while deaths may be down, the rate of coronary heart disease continues to increase by 85% over the last 23 years. The last study that I did, it was a forecast done in 2008, was looking at where chronic disease was going to be going between 2010 to 2025. And it was such a striking increase that I realized I could no longer stay on the sidelines, and that's why I became a wellness coach. A rather significant rate of increase in chronic disease is going to take place over the next 10 to 15 years. So it turns out that calcium and magnesium are in fact antagonists. Who knew? We hear a lot about calcium, but very little is known about magnesium, at least in the public domain. The research, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of articles about this, but they apparently are very carefully guarded. And what it turns out, one of the most important sources, at least for me, was the book by Carolyn Dean called The Miracle of Magnesium. This was published in 2003. And this is the book that got me started, and I read it last July. And since last July, I've gone on to read 18 other books and 300 articles, just so I have a better understanding of what this vital nutrient is all about. And what I can assure you is that when it is missing from our diet and missing from our body, your world gets very flat and very hard. And we're going to explore that a little bit more as we go forward. Now we're all dealing with stress. Who isn't dealing with stress? Well, what we find out as you get into the literature is that there's a very close link between stress and disease. It's very well established. Probably the most compelling study of the link between stress and disease was by the Canadian endocrinologist Hans Selye. He wrote a book entitled Calciphylaxis. It's a mouthful, but it's a very powerful book, 500 pages long, that outlines the impact of stress and what it does across broad spectrums of animals, including humans, and what it does to our metabolism. It's a very graphic book, and it's not for the faint of heart, but it certainly lays out what the dynamic is that we're talking about. Well, I know I can't ask you to raise your hand, but what I would ask you to do is take a look at these 10 factors amongst many that I could have listed, and just ask yourself, are you dealing with any of these 10 factors? Are you worried about cholesterol? Are you worried about anxiety attacks? Are you dealing with diabetes or prediabetes? Do you have chronic pain and some of the other factors? Well, here's the question. Do you know what the common origin is for all of these conditions? Well, it turns out that in fact, it's magnesium deficiency. Huh? Mag what? Well, let's take a closer look at this entire process. I want to point out that in Latin, the word doctor means teacher. And so as we go through this next series of slides, what I want you to be thinking about is, has your doctor taught you about this important series of mechanisms of how stress can in fact influence disease at different levels of abstraction? Well, I think it's pretty well established that stress can lead to a heart attack. In fact, I believe in Japan they call it karoshi, death by overwork. And I think there are striking examples of that worldwide, but at least the Japanese have gone so far as to actually name it. Well, it turns out that you can go down another level. And in fact, the very popular concept is that, in fact, metabolic syndrome is what causes heart disease. It's obesity, it's insulin resistance, it's the excess cholesterol, it's hypertension, and high triglycerides. And this cluster of dysfunction is in fact the precursor to the actual coronary heart disease. Well, it turns out that stress causes metabolic syndrome. Wow, who knew? But let's go down another level. And let's get inside the arteries, and what you'll find out is that inside the arteries are what are called endothelial cells. And when endothelial cells are under stress, they dysfunction. And when they dysfunction, a lot of bad things happen, like there's plaque buildup, calcification. But what is common to all of these different levels of stress is in fact magnesium deficiency. Again, it's very well established in the research, and I would encourage you to research yourselves and go out into the domain and begin to look up this information. I was stunned by how prevalent the information was once you begin to start digging for this kind of information. All right, so let's take a closer look at the endothelial issue, because it's very, very important to this entire coronary disease process. So here we have an example of what's happening inside the endothelium. And again, this is the one cell layer right inside your artery. It's a very critical part of your anatomy because it's highly influential in the disease process, particularly as it relates to high blood pressure. Well, it turns out that in fact there are at least 10 mechanisms taking place within the endothelial cells that are related to magnesium deficiency. Again, you don't have to take my word on it. You can look at this particular article by Jean Mayer, which is a very powerful article from just this year. I also happen to have 55 additional citations on this mechanism alone. But what I want to point out is just one section from Dr. Mayer's recent article in Clinical Science. And it turns out that what they're recognizing that is in fact magnesium deficiency is emerging as an inducer of endothelial dysfunction. And in fact, apparently, low extracellular magnesium reinforces the idea that correcting magnesium homeostasis, might be a very helpful and inexpensive way to prevent and treat endothelial dysfunction. It would be pennies on the dollar for what we're spending with all of the statin drugs. But let's not stop there. Let's go down yet another notch. And let's look inside the cell. And it turns out that in fact there's stress that's taking place inside the cell. That inflammation is the very first mechanism of stress. It's actually a very positive and constructive response on the part of the body, but it's unresolved inflammation or chronic inflammation that becomes so damaging. Well, unresolved inflammation leads to oxidation. We know it as rust, but inflammation leads to oxidation, and unresolved oxidation species, as they're called, lead to calcification. That is not a good thing. But again, it's all caused by magnesium deficiency. And here are the citations that are relevant to those particular concepts that are being proposed here. But let's not stop there. Let's go down one more step. So we've gone from societal stress to organ stress. Now we're inside the artery. Now we're inside the cell. Well, let's go inside the gene. It turns out that there's a concept called genetic stress. I didn't know this until just a couple weeks ago. And this concept of heat stress creates what are called heat stress proteins. HSP60, HSP70, and HSP90, just referring to the different size of the proteins. Well, guess what? They too are caused by magnesium deficiency. Again, very well established in the research, but it's something that we're not aware of. Our doctors haven't taken the time to bring this to our attention. All they tend to focus on is cholesterol, when it's a whole lot more complicated. And in fact, it's actually a whole lot more simple than that. And it turns out that magnesium is a key factor in this whole process. Or magnesium deficiency is a key factor in this whole process. But once you learn the entire mechanism, you can in fact apply it to every organ system in your body. Because it turns out that this oxidative stress affects not just the heart, it affects the brain, it affects joints, the kidney, blood vessels, multiple organs. And it would just encourage you to look at all the different conditions that are significantly influenced and lead to or the result of oxidative stress. And what's particularly interesting is that each specialty of medicine refers to it with a different word, as you'll see here. Cardiologists talk about it as atherosclerosis. Dermatologists refer to it as scleroderma. Someone who's working on your joints, maybe an orthopedic surgeon or maybe it's an internist, will refer to it as arthritis. A neurologist is going to refer to it as multiple sclerosis, when in fact it turns out that all of these different mechanisms all are the result of the same metabolic process of calcification. Again, you don't have to take my word for it. It turns out that magnesium deficiency is behind all of this dysfunction, and it's very well established in the research. I've highlighted 3 articles for you here, and I have 30 additional citations on this very significant inflammatory spectrum that affects all different components of our well-being. Well, Jen Lewis is a blogger. She has a great site that talks about calcification in a very simple fashion. If really what it comes down to is it's a lack of cellular energy. She couldn't have said it more beautifully, and it's just so powerfully, because the problem arises when there isn't enough magnesium and potassium to exchange for the increased rise in calcium and sodium. And what you're thinking right now is, it can't be that simple. Well, it turns out that in fact societal stress does in fact lead to organ stress, does in fact lead to metabolic stress, does in fact lead to cellular stress, and which ultimately leads to the genetic stress that causes the very mechanism of disease. And it's all the result of magnesium deficiency. And there, as you might expect, there's great resistance to this, even within the medical community. Resistance to this very simple model. And I've had an opportunity now to talk to a number of leading physicians around the country, just to ask them what they think of this. This is a conversation that I had with a leading plastic surgeon in the Midwest. He's the chair of a very significant department at a medical center in the Midwest. And his point was, well, magnesium is just not a popular drug these days. To which I responded, drug? It's not a drug. It's how the body works. It, in fact, activates 350 mechanisms, which is 80% of your metabolism. I happened to talk with an internist in the New Orleans area, and he said, magnesium? Oh, that's just voodoo medicine. Another physician that I happened to encounter out on the East Coast, well, I practice evidence-based medicine, not folk medicine. Then I was talking to an ER doc in the South, and he said, actually, no, I don't use magnesium that much in the ER. It really depends on the attending physician as to what I do, which actually intrigued me because I thought that would be one place where you really would want to use it, would be especially in the emergency room. So I happened to run across an emergency medical technician who informed me that, no, I'm not allowed to use magnesium. In fact, I have a very specific checklist that I'm to work from, and if it's a checklist of 10 items, magnesium would be 11th on that list. And then many of you may be familiar with the excitement that's taking place in Leroy, New York. And when I had an opportunity to talk to one of the leading physicians involved in that situation, his comeback when I asked about what he knew about magnesium deficiency as it related to the condition that these people were suffering from, he said, "What do you mean magnesium deficiency?" What I want to stress is that magnesium is a food. It is not a drug. This was a statement that was coined by Professor Pierre Delbé, who was a practicing physician in France during the First World War. It is so central to our body's function, and I really would encourage you to be very mindful of its role, and we'll talk a little bit more about ways in which we can restore its status in our bodies. But don't be misled into thinking that it's a drug. It is, in fact, a vital part of our food, and we need to preserve that component wherever we can. So my summation, as I look at all of these different levels of stress, and that they are, in fact, a result of magnesium deficiency, that in fact what has happened is that medicine as we know it today is a sophisticated, complicated, intimidating elephant skin over a magnesium deficient mouse. And you can quote me on that. After working in the industry for 32 years, I'm very surprised by the level of, I guess, discretion that's used about sharing this information with the public and with the patients. And just like the elephants are scared of mice, I think in many respects the medical profession, the allopathic physicians, are terrified of magnesium because of its wide-ranging impact on the body. It involves so many different facets of our metabolism, and it's a very powerful mineral despite its size. Well, as Winston Churchill so eloquently said, men occasionally stumble over the truth, but most of them pick themselves up and hurry off as if nothing happened. He's also quoted as of having said that a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants on. Either quote I think applies, but the point is this is in fact the truth of what's causing so much disease in this country. And I think it's important for you to take the time to begin to absorb what its significance is to you in your day-to-day life. So let me approach it from a slightly different angle. You may be familiar with the concept called the autonomic nervous system. There's a central nervous system, which we are all very familiar with, but running alongside the central nervous system is something called the autonomic nervous system, or what I call the always-on system. It's a very powerful part of our anatomy, and it's really what runs our body to an extraordinary extent. But there are two facets to the autonomic nervous system, and I apologize for getting technical, but this is very, very important to understand that in fact the electrolytes, magnesium, calcium, sodium, and potassium, and Mg is magnesium, Ca is calcium, Na is sodium, that's Latin, is nadium, and K is cadmium for calcium, or for potassium. That these four electrolytes, in fact, run the always-on system, and that there are some that run the parasympathetic and some that run the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, is what really runs the fight or flight response. So that when you are feeling like you're being attacked by a tiger, or there's this incredible deadline that you have to meet, or you're worried about being able to pay bills, that pressure that you feel inside your body is in fact it's the sympathetic nervous system or the fight or flight system that is driving you to that sense of tension. But there's the other side of the autonomic nervous system called the parasympathetic system, and that's the rest and recovery branch. In fact, we're designed to be about 10% sympathetic and about 90% parasympathetic. But in fact, what's happened in modern day America, and maybe very much throughout the world, is we've become very much in sympathetic overdrive. It rules our world, and it has a decided impact on our disease state. So it turns out that these electrolytes are very much influenced by the food we eat. And the other important thing to understand is that magnesium is a critical regulator of the other three electrolytes. As I mentioned earlier, it in fact regulates the hormones that control the levels of calcium, but magnesium activates the sodium-potassium pump. It's what enables that pump to work. Again, at the risk of getting too technical, just know that magnesium is a key regulator of the other three electrolytes. Let's take a look at the impact of diet. It turns out that if you look at the ancestral diet, again, the diet that was studied by Dr. Weston A. Price, that diet is very rich in magnesium and potassium, Mg being for magnesium and potassium being the K. Well, in fact, the potassium is what activates the parasympathetic nervous system, and magnesium, in fact, inhibits the sympathetic nervous system. And it does it very well. And what you find in the ancestral diet is rich sources based on bone broths and vegetables, particularly root vegetables, and rich sources of these two key minerals that are so important for activating the parasympathetic and quieting down the sympathetic nervous system. But in fact, what's happened to our diet, and so then the parasympathetic system is on, but what has happened is we are captives of what is known as the SAD diet, the standard American diet, which are heavily predominated by sources of calcium and sodium. Well, it turns out that calcium turns on the sympathetic nervous system, and sodium, in fact, inhibits the parasympathetic. And when you look at the standard American diet now, we have this overwhelming amount of calcium, which is activating the sympathetic nervous system and is causing the inflammation that is leading to the disease. Again, something that we're not taught, and it's so important to our overall health and vitality. So why is magnesium so important? Well, it's a key component of energy, and it's also a very key component of enzymes. You cannot create energy without magnesium. It's involved in what's called the Krebs cycle, and it is a vital part of creating ATP, which is the chemical that it's actually used to create energy, and it's involved in the actual breakdown of ATP. And in similar fashion, magnesium is a critical cofactor or catalytic agent in over 350 enzyme pathways that run our body. That's in fact about 80% of our metabolism. And it's very, very much involved in the formation of glutathione, which is something that eliminates mercury, which is a very toxic neurotoxin in our body. The very enzyme that is designed to regulate the amount of cholesterol in our body is in fact influenced by magnesium. And when magnesium levels are low, the HMG coenzyme A enzyme goes into overdrive and creates excess cholesterol. That is in fact the very reason why your cholesterol levels go up. It turns out that when you're under stress and you don't have enough magnesium to deal with that stress, that this enzyme creates cholesterol. Why? Because cholesterol is the precursor to a hormone called pregnenolone. And pregnenolone is in fact the precursor to all of the steroid hormones that are involved in the stress response. A very, very important concept to understand. Turns out that magnesium is critical to the detox pathways that can get rid of all the pesticide and the fluoride toxicity that many of us are worried about. As I pointed out, it runs the Krebs cycle through the enzyme magnesium ATPase. And as I pointed out at the beginning of the presentation, it is in fact the critical cofactor that converts the storage vitamin D into active vitamin D. If you're really interested in raising your vitamin D levels, I would encourage you to do two things: increase your intake of magnesium and spend more time outdoors. It's important to understand that there is in fact no life without magnesium. It's at the center of every chlorophyll molecule, and it's vital, and it's the actual essence of life as it exists on the planet. As very well established by Mildred Seelig in her classic article called "The Requirement of Magnesium by the Normal Adult." I would highly recommend you take a look at that. Despite its age, it is a true classic and has just profound insights about the importance of this mineral in our day-to-day metabolism. And there is disease without magnesium. What I'm highlighting here are studies that go back into the 30s that highlight the significant impact that magnesium deficiency has on causing disease, particularly calcification. This has been very well studied, very well researched, and very well chronicled in the literature. It's just we've never known this. Again, Mildred Seelig is a rich source for this information, particularly as it's laid out in her book, The Pathophysiology of Magnesium Deficiency. What I should also point out is that the earliest article that I could find about the calcium to magnesium ratio was from 1922, where they purposely increased the calcium intake and pulled back on the magnesium intake, and lo and behold, they caused depression in people with that experiment from the 1920s. The intelligentsia have known about this for a long, long time, and it's time that the public have a better understanding of what's going on inside our bodies. So what happened? Well, it turns out that our ancestors lived in what's called a very magnesium-rich environment, but it was also very calcium-poor. Going back millions of years, this idea that man existed in this very rich environment of magnesium is very important to understand. And the way the body is designed, it turns out that we are constructed in a way that the body holds on to calcium very tightly, and that's why there are, in fact, 3 hormones to preserve it. But we're also designed to let go of magnesium at the slightest provocation, in large part because the body knew that there was always going to be magnesium-rich water, magnesium-rich food, and magnesium-rich sea vegetables in order and sea animals to feed from. Well, and it is theorized that our ancestors ate as much as 1,500 milligrams of magnesium per day. Obviously, they were much more active. They had a much different lifestyle, but there was a very different environment that they grew up in. And today, what is our environment? Well, it's very, very different. We, in fact, live in what I would call a calcium tsunami. There's an overwhelming amount of calcium. It's a magnesium desert, and at best, Americans are getting about 300 milligrams of magnesium per day. It's simply not enough to run our bodies, and it is taking a metabolic toll on Americans all across the country. So it's important to understand how Maggie gets drained. In one word, it's stress. And it comes in many different forms, as you can see as I move my way around this wheel. And this is very well established in the research. There are other factors that I could have included. I could have highlighted the impact that microwave technology has, particularly as it relates to cell phones. They are, in fact, mini microwaves. But the greatest source of stress in our lives is, in fact, the mental and emotional stress that we're engaged in daily. It's our negative thoughts, it's our worry, it's our fear, and it takes a tremendous toll on magnesium, or as I affectionately refer to it, as Maggie. And so what you're thinking is, well, if it's so dire, why hasn't so-and-so said something to me? Why haven't my friends and family? Well, actually, we're all waiting for Magellan's ship to come back. My trainer, well, they're too focused on calories in and calories out. A very outdated concept, but nonetheless, that's what their focus is. What about my grocer? Well, it turns out that the vast majority of the food that appears in store shelves are controlled by a handful of firms. My physician. Why hasn't my physician said something to me? At best, they get about an hour of nutrition during the course of all of their training, and at the present time, they're just too lost in their prescriptions and trying to diagnose and then write a prescription for what they think is the best course of action for you to take. But what about my public health department? Sorry, they're stuck in the germ theory. Just so you know, that was a concept that was developed by Louis Pasteur back in the 1860s. It's a concept that has outlasted its usefulness, if I may be so bold. What about my news station? Well, they're not about to bite the hand that feeds them. And it turns out that they are very dependent on advertising from food companies as well as pharmaceutical companies. And what about my government? Well, it turns out that calcium is just too good for the GNP. When you step back from it, it turns out that 40 cents on the dollar is tied up in doctors and hospitals, drugs, and toxic food that keeps us all in a suspended state of dis-ease. And it's just an enormous amount of our economy is wrapped up in that whole mechanism. And let me point out, you're probably thinking, well, this was a very interesting presentation on the mechanism of stress and how it affects coronary heart disease, but you haven't said one word about cholesterol. Well, let me introduce you to the guy who actually invented the whole concept that's called the diet heart hypothesis. His name was Ancel Keys, a famous physiologist from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and maybe even beyond that time. But one of his great contributions was he was the individual who designed what became known as the K rations. That was the food that kept the troops alive during the Second World War. An enormous contribution to society, and he deserves tremendous recognition for that. But he felt very strongly about the fact that cholesterol was the principal cause of heart disease, and when he first proposed it, it was hotly debated in the cardiology community, and there was tremendous resistance to this concept. But he was a very influential man, and over time he won over and basically browbeat the entire cardiology research and medical community to see it his way. Well, in his later years, when he was in his late 80s, he wrote, or he was actually interviewed by the New York Times. And this interview coincided with the launch of statin drugs, particularly Lipitor, that was continues to be very, very successful. And the salient quote here is, "I've come to think that cholesterol is not as important as we used to think it was. Let's reduce cholesterol by reasonable means, but let's not get too excited about it." That's a pretty powerful assertion for the individual who actually created the diet heart hypothesis. Well, 4 years later, when he was approaching his 90th year, he wrote a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine. It doesn't get much bigger than that. And he was talking about a client of his who ate 25 eggs a day. And he makes a very sterling observation. There's no connection whatsoever between cholesterol in food and cholesterol in blood, and we've known that all along. Cholesterol in the diet doesn't matter unless you happen to be a chicken or a rabbit. Wow. I didn't know that. Did you know that? That there's no connection whatsoever between cholesterol in food and cholesterol in blood? Then what have we been doing for the last 50 years in this country, changing the entire dietary policy? What an extraordinary unveiling of truth. And here's something else that your doctor probably hasn't taught you. But when Andrea Rosanoff and Mildred Seelig teamed up to write The Magnesium Factor back in 2003, a very, very important book that I would strongly encourage you to read, they shared some research that was done that looked at the impact of statin drugs versus magnesium as it related to the control of cholesterol levels. And in fact, it turns out that magnesium won this contest in large part for two reasons. One, it regulates not just the HMG coenzyme A enzyme that I mentioned earlier, but also another very key enzyme called LCAT, which is also involved in the formation of cholesterol, and the statin drugs are only able to function or focus on the one. The other really significant fact is that where statin drugs in fact raise liver enzymes beyond the normal levels, magnesium does not have that influence or that impact at all. But the other point that is worth noting is over to the right side of the screen. It turns out that when you have cholesterol in a magnesium-rich environment, which we are designed to be, that LDL in fact becomes HDL. So it turns out that in fact we have been misled and we are being misfed. And I think it's high time that we begin to take control of our destiny and begin to act on this information. And here's the back end of the research that I alluded to earlier by Heikki Karppinen. This was a study that was done in 2000, and this was tracking the impact of the salt that he created that was designed to lower the amount of sodium but increase the amount of potassium and especially the magnesium level, to see if that one mechanism alone would be enough to reverse the coronary heart disease. Now, in most epidemiological studies, if you reduce disease by, say, 2 or 3% over the course of a 20-year period, that's an extraordinary accomplishment. Well, it turns out that what happened in Finland was a 60% reduction in coronary heart deaths in Finland, especially in North Karela, where it was highest of any place on the planet. And yet, we don't know about this study. In fact, it took Jonathan Wright, who is a practicing physician in Tahoma, Washington. It took him, he tried for 17 years to get the pan salt that's based on Dr. Kaprenan's last name, but he tried to get the pan salt imported to America, and he was never able to overcome all of the hurdles. So he sought out and decided to make his own based on Dr. Kaprenan's salt, and it's known as right salt, and we'll see that in a minute. But it's amazing that we don't know about this very, very, very significant study in reversing heart disease through just the use of salt alone. And what impact it would have in this country if we were able to do it is absolutely amazing, but yet it's never been tried. Okay, so who wants to learn how to take control of the health? I'm sure there's no one out there in the audience that wouldn't want to have some greater control over that very mechanism. Well, the first thing in the morning, what I'd like you to do is, well, before you do this, go to your health food store to buy some pH paper. And then first thing in the morning, I want you to test your urine pH after you've been asleep for about 6 hours. And if your urine happens to be below 6.0, it turns out you need more magnesium. This is very well established by Dr. Russell Jaffe. He is a physician scientist living in the Washington, D.C. area, and a major proponent of magnesium, and I think he has a very good grasp of this very disease process. But in his opinion, magnesium turns out to be the major buffering mineral, is in fact magnesium, and most importantly, it's the major alkalizing and neutralizing mineral in the urine. So this is a very powerful way. You've heard from so many different sources how important it is to alkalize your body. Well, this is a great way to do it, and there are many different ways that we can bring magnesium into the body, as we'll see in just a minute. That's it? That's all I've got to do? You mean, obviously, picking up on Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz? All I had to do was click my two heels together? I mean, all I have to do is do a urine pH every morning? Yeah, it turns out that it's that easy. Because when you begin to restore your magnesium level, the inflammation will go down. The stress that you've been dealing with will go down. Think of magnesium as the chill pill. And when all of that stress, whether it's at a societal level, that sense of anxiety, all the way down to a genetic level, when all of that is neutralized with magnesium, the disease process stops in its tracks. So here's a 5-step plan that I would encourage you to undertake. I want you to do whatever you can to curb your stress patterns, whether it happens to be mold in your home, or whether it's the diet that you're eating, or other factors where it's just the anxiety or the worry that you have. Begin to take steps to mitigate that. There are many different programs that you can use, but I would really ask you to look at that very closely and make sure you're taking the adequate steps to reverse that. Secondly, a lot of us are dealing with gut issues. We've been exposed to antibiotics. We've been exposed to challenging foods. And it's important to take the steps that are needed to really allow the body to have appropriate hydrochloric acid levels, but also have the proper gut health in order to absorb the nutrients, especially the nutrients that are in our diet. I would really encourage you to examine the importance of an ancestral diet. Please go to the WestonAPrice.org website. You'll see tremendous information there about the benefits and the value of this very rich and nutrient-dense diet. And I would encourage you to commit to that. And the Weston A. Price Foundation is just a treasure trove of information. Or please consider the website from my colleague Sean Croxton, who has an organization known as Underground Wellness, and he refers to the food groups as the JERF 30. Just eat real food, and he identifies 30 different foods that are really important to eat. I would encourage you to go to his website as well. Supplement with mineral drops, and also evaluate the risks of a magnesium depleting diet. Whenever you're taking excess calcium, it prevents the body from being able to absorb magnesium. It's just the way the body works. It can't absorb both minerals at the same time, and it has to take preference. And when there's excess of one over the other, it will always absorb that more predominant mineral. And given the average diet in America, we are making it very difficult for our bodies to absorb the magnesium. The other thing that I would bring to your attention is that excess fluoride is very devastating on our health, and despite what you may think about that fluoride is good for our teeth, it really isn't anywhere near as good as you may think, and in fact the research is proving just the opposite. But I would encourage you to be sensitive to the fact that many of the medications that you're taking, the prescription medications, do in fact have fluoride in them, and that causes a rapid depletion of the magnesium in your body. It's a concept that we can't go into at this point, but it's something that you need to be aware of in your day-to-day diet. And then I would encourage you to take the steps to build your parasympathetic tone. Regardless of your religious background, take the time each day to meditate, to pray, to engage in yoga, or even to engage in tapping. And I think there's some tremendous benefits that people derive from that. And just calming down your reaction to your environment is very, very important. Please, when you're eating, make sure you're sitting down, but don't allow it to be in a car. And if it's at all possible, eat with candles. You can't imagine how that changes your whole sense of perspective, and your awareness of your anxiety levels will in fact begin to subside as you begin to have that more rested position for eating. Please take a bath at least once a week, in addition to the showers that you're taking, but use magnesium oil in those baths, or use Epsom salts, which is just magnesium sulfate. But please take the time to decompress and allow yourself the luxury of that process of just slowing your life down. Learn how to breathe slowly and deeply. It's tremendously important. But probably most important of all, the fastest way to activate the parasympathetic nervous system is to express gratitude. And it lights up your brain like a Christmas tree. It's so important to have that regular awareness of gratitude for all that you have, and allow yourself to immerse your being in that very positive emotion. Parasympathetic tone is very, very important. And then take the steps to restore Maggie in your life on a daily basis. Wherever possible, get magnesium water and mineral drops that are very rich sources of magnesium. A company that I would encourage you to track down is called Noah's Water. They're actually based out of Modesto, California, and they are the distributor of magnesium-rich water that comes from a spring called the Adobe Springs, based in California. This water has 110 milligrams of magnesium per liter, which is an extraordinarily rich source of magnesium, and I think you would find it just so refreshing, and it's also has a very high pH. It's the best tasting water I've ever experienced, and would encourage you to consider that as a source. And they're in the process of setting up distributorships across the country so that it'll become increasingly easier and easier to get access to this water. And the mineral drops from the company called Mineral Resources International. We use them regularly in our clinic, and I would encourage you to track them down. They just make an exceptional product, and it's minerals from the Salt Lake City, from the Great Salt Lake, based out of Salt Lake City, and would encourage you to use that as part of your daily routine. Wherever possible, I would encourage you to use an oral form of magnesium. I have the good fortune of being affiliated with Jigsaw Health. They're one of my sponsors, and I'm very proud of the product that they produce. It's called dimagnesium malate, and it's also has vitamin B6, which is a critical cofactor for bringing magnesium inside the cell, and they make an exceptional product, and they make other products as well, but their magnesium product is just a tremendous way to bring magnesium back into your body. But there are many other forms. There's magnesium glycinate, there's magnesium taurate, and a new product that I would encourage you to read up on is magnesium L-threonate. And it's focusing on restoring magnesium in the brain tissue, and I think you're going to find it to be a very exciting product because it's really gearing at reversing a lot of the dysfunction in the brain that results from Alzheimer's and other neurotoxic conditions. The research on it is just extraordinary. Consider using Right Salt. I mentioned it. It comes from Dr. Jonathan Wright at the Tahoma Clinic, and the website is the tahomadispensary.com. It's very low in sodium, with an increase in amounts of potassium and magnesium. And as I said, it's based on the pan salt. It will surprise you with how good it tastes, and it's just introducing you to these very important minerals that are so essential in our day-to-day lives. Of course, magnesium-rich foods, sea vegetables, particularly kelp, very, very important. Bone broth, as I mentioned. This is one of the most mineral-dense sources of food that you can find on the planet. And it takes time, but it's just so worth the effort of allowing your body to get the full benefit of the rich mineral sources that are available in these bones. Almonds and cashews and pistachios, along with pumpkin seeds. It turns out that any seed is a rich source of magnesium in all of its forms, and spices are another source of magnesium. And there are other sources like oysters and other forms of seafood. But buckwheat and millet and maize are also very rich in magnesium, as are beet and collard greens and other leafy greens, as you would expect, because of the chlorophyll. It's a very, very important source of magnesium. And finally, I would encourage you to use a transdermal form. Magnesium chloride, which is basically dehydrated seawater, is just a very important source of magnesium. The magnesium chloride is the dehydrated seawater, and the magnesium sulfate, we know it as Epsom salts. A great source for this, though, is healthandwisdom.com. They make a source of their magnesium chloride is, again, from the Great Salt Lake. It's a wonderful product. I would encourage you to look into that. So that gives you a real broad spectrum of steps that you can take to restore magnesium in your daily life. But I also want you to have some fun with your doctor. And I want you to ask the following question. If there's a situation where you're faced with getting a prescription, I want you to ask the doctor, so how is this drug that you're about to prescribe going to reverse my obvious magnesium deficiency? What I can assure you is that when you ask the question just that way, that the magnesium levels in their sphincters will drop precipitously. I hope you can have some fun with that. So what I'm here to tell you is that, in fact, Magellan's ship has come home. That magnesium makes your world go round. Think about that. Magnesium makes your world go round. It's such a vital part of our anatomy, and it has been so methodically taken out of our diet and been taken out of our water, and I didn't have a chance to go into all of that. But just know that there was a time when it was a rich part of our environment, and it is no longer. So we have to take assertive action to bring it back into our diet. And there's so many different companies out there and so many different sources of food, and we need to make it a regular part of our daily regimen. And please take the steps to do it. And parachutes, just like sails, are very similar to the mind. They only work when they're open, and I hope you have an open mind about this message that I'm sharing with you during the course of this presentation. And this is, in fact, an artist's rendering of what Magellan's ship looked like when it was coming back from its many-year circumnavigation of the globe. And to quote the great Mildred Seelig, magnesium is the mineral of motion. Anytime you're thinking about the fact that you don't feel right, that things are just not flowing for you, that your heart's not pumping the way you think it should be, or if you've got so many of the different symptoms that are out there of magnesium deficiency, just think about the fact of how effectively this mineral can shift that whole state of motion, that whole state of homeostasis. And please take the steps to go through that 5-step plan to restore magnesium in your life. We don't have an opportunity to see this video, but please go to the following website, www.magmg2move.com, and I think you will find it to be a very entertaining and very informative video about the value of magnesium and what it can do for you in your daily life. So I leave you with this last thought. Are you ready to join our magnesium movement? I certainly hope you are. I appreciate your taking the time to go through this presentation and look forward to any questions that you might have. Please, you can reach out to me at my website, Nexus Whole Health. You can certainly write me an email as noted, but don't hesitate to phone me. I've never met a question I didn't enjoy, and I look forward to answering and enriching your understanding the questions that you might have about this critical mineral. Thank you so much, and good success and good fortune to you as you begin to explore the wonderful and magical world of magnesium.